Thank you for everyone who came out tonight. I know there's a lot happening. I have two friends also giving lectures the very same night. So I appreciate you making the effort to come down. We are going to be watching, the whole first part of the program is going to be on 16 millimeter, which means it's a small projection, and I'm just looking at these empty seats in front. If you want to see it closer, you should come down. I just encourage you to come down and get a better view of it, because it is a small projection on 16. That's how the throw works. So I'd like to start out by in letting everyone know that you are at a screening that's going to be around the duration of 27 minutes, and it's featuring 4 different artists' work, and it's inspired by the exhibition upstairs. And I'd like to to start out by thanking Anna Katz, who's here in the audience. She is the curator of the exhibition, and I first spoke with her about these ideas, and she was receptive to my pitch of putting together a night of moving image works in relationship and inspired to and sort of thinking through some of the ideas within her exhibition. So I'd like to thank Anna for having me, and then I'd like to thank Amanda Hunt from the Education Department and Programs Department for working with me on this event. And then I'd like to thank Alex Harrington. I know she's somewhere up there. Thank you. She was very diligent about procuring a lot of films and GIFs and videos from various, very kind of delicate situations, so thank you very much. And then I'd also like to thank the projectionists tonight. We have Mark Ayala, as well as David Chien. And we have to especially thank them because this is a treat to get to see films projected on 16 millimeter, which is what's going to happen. And we have to say that, you know, at this point, they're sort of like magicians. Not that many people know how to project film. So we have to kind of bow down in their presence. Thank you very much. Up in the projection booth. And so I wanted to start out just giving you some background on why I'm interested in this subject and sort of some thinking through how I came to this idea of putting together films. And it comes from a pretty personal place. This is my mother, and she's an artist, and she started working really in the 60s. She went to UCLA, and she was, she's kind of a loner, and so she likes to work on her own. But she was sort of peripherally involved in some various feminist art groups that were happening in the 70s, and involved in the 70s consciousness-raising groups and so forth. And she moved out of drawing and painting, which she was studying at UCLA, and started working with really unusual materials, many that had a sense of glitter and opalescence and diffraction. And as she went into the 70s, so she started painting with nail polish when I was a little kid. And then when she went into the later 70s and into the 80s, we all know, because we've all been upstairs, what the aesthetic of the 80s are. She started working with this material called diffraction foil and started making weavings. And so, in a sense, she was not part of this movement at all. She was completely removed from it. But in a way, she was engaging with really similar ideas, and this sort of way of engaging and using motifs from craft and low art, and then incorporating them in a really inventive way into her work. And when I was a young teenager, she used to hire me and my friends to actually help her meet deadlines in her studio. So we actually fabricated some of her work for her. And these later, she started working with postcards in mosaic form, and then later on linoleum tiles. So I like to credit her just for how she used materials. It's always been really inspiring to me. And I think when I came to work with film, it was something I really wanted to do because I wanted to set myself apart from my mother, which we all know how that works. And so thinking about tonight, I wanted to give you a little backstory on how I came up with this particular selection of these 4 artists. I really approached tonight in a very personal way, so sort of choosing works that I knew of, but also engaging with some research. So the very first thing I did was I asked Anna if I could have a preview copy of the catalog. And I read her essay as well as all the other essays in the book, because I wanted to really think about what she was doing in the show and then see how I could translate that to what I was thinking about with film. And I already had specific films and video-based works in mind, but really it helped me to sort of solidify and cull down my list. My list was much, much longer, and there are a number of works that I wished I could have included, but many of those works were quite long as an hour, or, we would have been here all night, which would have been incredible. So that's sort of another screening. But I ended up sort of really editing down the selections based on some of the ideas that she had put forth in the exhibition. And then the second thing I did in the research process was I just researched every single artist in the show to see if there were remote chance that they had made a film or video that fit with this particular theme that I was working with in this kind of set of years. And so there are artists in the exhibition like Howardina Pindell and Linda Benglis who were making videos pretty actively. But at that time, there was a lot of interest sort of in around self-imaging and very political, kind of precise works that weren't necessarily of this school of thought of some of the earlier works from the 60s and 70s, say from the Vasilkas and so forth. So from there, I decided to showcase a film by a British filmmaker named Lis Rhodes that I have never had the chance to see on film. And it is a seminal film, and it's made in a really specific way, which I'm going to go into. And before I do that, I just want to read a quote from Anna from her essay. So interestingly, I chose the title of this screening, Promiscuous Patterns, from a section that was titled this in the catalog, which I found out from Anna the other day was also something under consideration for the title of the exhibition. And what she says in this section about patterns is, after all, patterns are impure. They are no scale, are loyal to no medium, or no material. Patterns are superficial. As surfaces, patterns slip and slide off and on, slithering and hopping from pot to clothing fabric. To rug, to wallpaper, to mosaic dome. Patterns are promiscuous, and that is their special, non-specialized power, their unvirtuous virtue. She continues, patterns are promiscuous because they proliferate, willy-nilly, appearing anywhere from the trims of pillowcases to wedge-shaped sections in barrel-vaulted cathedral ceilings. So I kind of took this and just thought about it and thought about the works that I wanted to choose. And I made a bunch of Venn diagrams just today. So I was thinking about this, because something that's really interesting is we're very lucky because we have one of the filmmakers, Jody Mack, here. And so she's going to get to fill in even more information on these Venn diagrams. But I was thinking there are these different communities of production, of education, production, communities of presentation and distribution within film. So there are films that are shown within the film festival circuit and the film festival world, and there's community-based organizations that both produce and showcase film, like the ones that we have here in town. So everything from Coaxial to the Echo Park Film Center and so forth. So these kinds of audiences really shift. They're not necessarily only in the art context, but then there's a lot of crossover between these various communities. So I thought it would be interesting to pull from these various communities into this context where they're being seen within this art museum in a film program in relationship to a show that's about painting and decoration. And so sort of kind of thinking, can we consider all of this together, even though it was not a movement together, but there definitely are relationships between the works I'm showing you today. So you can kind of think, one of the things that really interested me in all of these artists was this engagement with technology as a material, and with being incredibly inventive, both playfully inventive, both materially inventive with these mediums in really unusual and interesting ways. And so that's one of the things that I wanted to highlight. And then just women in technology, so this kind of agency that women kind of took with working with abstraction in a particular way. So there's this kind of agency. I certainly felt that myself working with film. I felt very powerful because I could do this thing that not everyone could do. And so it was my way of being able to communicate with the world. And then in these particular works, obviously there's a strong use of pattern. And you can even see it in some works. Don't worry, you're just gonna have to close your eyes maybe a few times. It's somewhat assaultive, the kind of pattern, the sort of overuse of the pattern in the work. And then other times it's incredibly joyful. I think Jody's films are not hard to watch. And then thinking also in terms of computer-generated works, and for example, Lillian Schwartz, who's in the pink area, is one of the pioneers of the earliest films that were made on computers. Of course, they were made on computers, they were shot on film, and so forth, in order to record them because there wasn't a way to record. So kind of looking at these different overlaps, and then we have these two younger artists who have relationships to the kind of pioneers from the 60s and 70s. And I will say, when you're dealing with the years 1972 to 1985, it's really specific because you can't use any of the wild experimentation from the 60s into the very early 70s. And Anna, the earliest film I have on here is 71. And I really wanted to be able to pull from this era because it is very specific, and the work that was being made is obviously influenced from everything that's happening in visual culture around this country and the world at that time. So both in terms of the medium specificity and how they're having access, say through Bell Labs, which is what Lillian Schwartz did, to the technology, and also just the culture itself. And that includes, as I said, the 80s, which had a really specific movement of animation in this country in particular. So here is another one of my Venn diagrams. And I wanted to think about the kind of communities and sort of early impulses that people came through. And I like in Jody's, it just says Chicago. But it's also a lot more than that, and she's gonna be able to tell us more about that tonight. But really thinking through, say, Lillian coming through, experiments in art and technology, through the kitchen in New York, through Bell Labs, where there was a lot of engagement with technology in various kinds and a lot of experimentation taking place in a very ephemeral way. And then Lis Rhodes coming through London and actually being part and starting and founding this feminist film distribution company, and being part of the London's Filmmakers Co-op, and a very well-known and beloved artist in the UK. And the film that we're gonna see tonight of hers is an outstanding. I'm very excited to show it to you. So just kind of thinking about this whole thing, and in the end, even though many of these artists are well-known, they kind of came out of different communities and worlds. And so you can see something like with Petra Kortright, who started working in the mid to late 2000s. So then she's dealing with technology, and these pieces that she's making are using Maya, for example, and early Adobe Image Maker prior to Photoshop. So she's engaging with this new technology. And I think people were sort of suspicious at the time, but now you can just look back historically and think, oh, that's kind of interesting to think about how it operated. And then those are just being presented on blogs and websites. So then this is the last thing, the very last one that I wanted to put up, was just thinking about these various kinds of communities and how and where all this work is being seen. And it's really interesting. I was just in, where was I? I was in Shanghai, and I was talking to someone about film, and we were talking about how the art world actually has become part of the preservation world, because people in the art world are still interested in shooting in film and preserving on film. And then obviously, additionally, in the independent film world, which we'll get to talk more about with Jody Mack later. And I just added, because I think some of the, like if I had my way, maybe I'd have put in like one of the really interesting artists who does light shows at techno shows, for example, because there's some really good ones. So it's just kind of like, well, that's a populist form, right? So like if you bring that into the museum, what happens? So those are just some of the things that I'm interested in putting together this particular program. And I just, there's something really specific about the first film I'm going to show that I want to highlight, because it also has to do with all of Jody Mack's films as well. So within filmmaking, there's a very obscure practice. I don't know, Jody, maybe you can tell me how obscure we actually think this is, or how many people know about this. But there's this practice of drawing or printing directly onto the optical soundtrack. And that's how they say the earliest optical, or the first electronic sounds were ever made, were by people printing images or drawing directly on the optical soundtrack, playing it through the projector, and making a sound. So they kind of say like, oh, that's what my nose sounds like. But it's just the shape of the nose becoming data, going through the projector and producing electronic sound. So this film in particular is linking sound and image completely, as are Jody Mack's. So what you're seeing visually is extended onto the soundtrack. And with Lis Rhodes, the way that she made this film is she used letraset onto the film directly. And then she just extended that into the soundtrack. I might have her optical printing part sort of off on that. Hang on one second. And yeah, so just, this was also made while she was still a student at the Northeast London Polytechnic, exploring the relationship between image and sound. And just to cohesively say this, to make Dresden Dynamo, Rhodes applied a set of stickers to a 16mm film, which produced a range of curious sounds when the film was played. Of this film, Rhodes had said, it was an attempt to make material connection between what is seen and what is heard. The image is sound. She considers her work to be incredibly political, and that's how she thinks of how she uses abstraction. So let's go on here. And then I just wanted to put sort of foregrounding these two artists who are these pioneers. Lillian Schwartz, who I mentioned, she has a very long history with art, so she was working in many different forms of art before coming to and starting to experiment at the kitchen, at happenings, and in New York at EAT, E-A-T, the Experiment for Art and Technology. And through that process, she met someone who sort of got her, I'm going to say, a gig at the Bell Computer Labs. And there she met someone who she began to collaborate with. So she started learning computer programming. She did not end up doing it as much herself, but she would collaborate with someone. But an incredible pioneer of all of these early computer films that have soundtracks, where she would also collaborate with musicians to make these scores for her work. So we're going to see two of her films tonight. And then lastly, I'm just going to say this quote from Petra Kortright. So I end the program with 3 GIFs from Petra. And these are on her website, so anyone can go see it. She has, sort of historical website now at this point that she doesn't update anymore, but it's her whole archives. And she said of the work that she made, she said, I failed the class, so she was taking a class on Maya. because I was supposed to be making a photorealistic hand using UV mapping. Everyone else was working diligently on making the skin, etc. And I was just obsessed with how beautiful the software was, so was taking screenshots and ultimately failed the class and the project. So with that, I'd like to start the program. We're gonna play it continuously through. It's 27 minutes, and the first 4 films are gonna be on 16 millimeter, and then we're gonna switch to digital projection. So like I said, the people in the front have the best spots. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you all for being here for the screening, and we're really lucky tonight to have Jody Mack in attendance. She just came down from the Headlands. She was doing the residency up there, and apparently some marathon animation sessions that she just partook in. And so I think it would be interesting to start just thinking about these 3 specific films that we just showed, and then maybe hearing your thoughts both on how you think of them in terms of the context of seeing them in an art museum and in this exhibition. And then I also would like to hear more about your thoughts in using pattern and in working with filmed textiles in general.
Sure. Well, thank you all so much for being here tonight. It's great to see such a full house. And thank you so much, Jennifer, for including me in your program. And it was great to listen to your notes and watch your great Venn diagram slides before this started. Anyway, so I've made probably about 15 films with different types of patterns, some of them being textile patterns. And these 3 films, well, it's funny because they're kind of from another time at this point, and by now, I've now finished a feature film about how patterns move in textiles. So I was really inspired by Anna's quote about the promiscuity of patterns, because they really don't discriminate, and it's like, yeah, I'll get with a vase, I'll get with a rug, it's all good. So and that was finished in 2018, and these are 2012, 2013. So almost at the very beginning of my inquiries into pattern. And all the films that we showed tonight were made with stuff that I owned. 2 were blankets purchased at thrift stores, and one of them was a collection of paisley that we had lying around the house. And at this point, it's funny because I think the way that I saw these films speaking to minimalist flicker films of the 70s, I see a similar relationship playing out in the art show today when you think about something like, or someone like Miriam Shapiro in relation to Frank Stella, or normal Frank Stella, as we would consider it, which is what I'm trying to say is that you usually always need to examine Miriam Shapiro or craft-based work, pattern and decoration movement in relation to what was occupying the mainstream at the time. So at one point in time, I like to consider myself kind of the Ava Hesse of flicker film, because of course she had imparted all of this amazing textural work onto cubes and things like that. But really, I was very interested and inspired by the temporal experiments of flicker films from the 60s and 70s, particularly the work of Tony Conrad and Paul Scherritz. But I found the work very minimal, sterile, unemotional, etc. And so wondered what would happen if you started to play with real materials under the camera. And then something else that speaks to the speed of the films of mine that you saw tonight in relation to the Lis Rhodes, which came before it, and the Lillian Schwartz, which came after it. And maybe some of you understand this and some of you don't, but the Lis Rhodes film was made without a camera. She was using the film strip as the canvas itself and working on frames kind of the size of my fingernail. And that mode of working creates a metabolism and a speed in cinema that you really can't touch in any other type of animation. It's really hard to approximate. Because as we think of animation, it's known as a sequential art form, right? Like, I want to wave my hand, so I need this picture, and this picture, and this picture, and this picture, and this picture. But that approach to animation doesn't actually empower our eyes and brains to work together in all the ways that they potentially can. So I like to think of my work more along the lines of something like anti-animation or stroboscopic animation, which opens up the perceptual possibilities of the perception of motion. So in something like Persian Pickles, we're forcing motion upon things that are very discontinuous. And I think a lot about the relationship between sort of like continuous discontinuity and discontinuous continuity, and if that actually is a difference. We could talk about that a little bit later. Anyway, so I started making these flicker films where the animation is kind of forced stroboscopically from one image to the next, which is very unlike the Lillian Schwartz work of the first piece that we saw, where the information is very fluid. Though you can draw a very direct parallel between early computer animation and cameraless animation on film, because you're both manipulating the material of the medium, be it the film strip or the code of the computers, as you will. So it's a very long-winded answer to the first part of your question, but just to move on to the second part about filming textiles. Yeah, again, that's a question that's been really expanded to me by the work of my feature film. Textiles are they're such loaded objects, carrying this discrepancy between perceived notions of high and low. There's a lot within textiles as far as the history of mapping space. I think of them as sort of one of the first two-dimensional portals to be able to think about something like cartography or mapping. And through textiles, we can think a lot about standardization of space and time in general. And another thing, of course, especially because we ended with Petra Courtwright's pieces, you know, the jacquard loom is basically one of the first uses of binary code. So there's just all these relationships there that make the textile a really, really fertile conduit for life and arts problems. There's just so much going on in every individual piece, whether it's a labor issue, whether it's a decorative versus content issue, whether it's a handmade goods versus industrially produced goods issue, or any of those issues and how they speak to the place of the museum in our culture. This isn't the first time that my works have been included in museum context with this type of work, specifically the pattern and decoration movement. I had about 12 sculptures in the Museum of Art and Design's retrospective on Miriam Shapiro, which is when I really got to give this kind of work a second thought, because I hadn't really ever considered the relationship. But I think, again, the thing that really strikes me about it is how we always have to talk about the work in relation to something bigger or real. Like, isn't it interesting that this work plays with high and low in the way that all work would never consider? That is I don't even really see the difference between high and low. And that's why you see me working with stuff from TJ Maxx in my films. So I think that there's just such a complex and multifaceted relationship that the textile shares to not only art museums, but also natural history museums, or museums and the formulation of history in general.
Yeah, and I think one of the things before opening it up that I wanted to touch on, or that I was thinking a lot about, was both the edit or the stroboscopic as making the pattern in time, right? So you also have the pattern within the frame, but through the methods that you're using of alternating amounts of frames, you're creating the pattern in time in the edits. So I think it's an interesting way to think about pattern, seeing a visual pattern, because if you think about the flicker film, that's all it's doing, right? It's just going back and forth. But in addition, these pieces in particular, what Lis Rhodes talked about how she wanted to have the sound be seen, right? Or have the scene be the sound in that piece. And so I thought about that a lot in these pieces, and I thought it really beautifully how you were alternating the sound. So it was sort of like, oh, this, like when it was a knitted piece, the way you started alternate it really slow, and then you could see really clearly how the knitting, when it was more dense, produced one sound, and this way, of both linking the sound and image, but also giving the visual the sound, right, and abstracting that. Can you talk more about if you've done other films along these lines with the sound and image, or is this a particular series that you wanted to do that with?
I'd love to talk more about this. Thank you so much for that question. So, yeah, the 3 films that you saw today, the images that you're seeing are also making the soundtrack. In 16 millimeter film, the aspect ratio is generally 4:3, which is closer to a square, than 16:9, which is our contemporary aspect ratio, something a little wider. But in the 90s, I think, people started shaving off the gates of the 4:3 cameras so that you could shoot on film to project on video. You can't actually ever watch a wide angle 16 millimeter film. All of that extra stuff is going into the soundtrack portion. And on the 16 millimeter projector, there's 2 light bulbs, and one is reading the image and one is reading the sound. And you can make sound. There's basically just a photoreceptor, a light bulb, that's reading different values and opacity as a way to make sound. And you can do ultra-realistic representations of sound via recording and transmitting these sounds to images, or you can do the opposite, which is translate the images to sounds. And a lot of the film-based work in this type of practice originates back to pretty much Russian optical disc experiments of the 1920s, and a lot of these do amount to some of the first synthesized sounds. So every time you pump your fist to a farty sounding sub bass out there, you can thank experimental animators because it also had a much bigger.
It's like Oscar Fischinger.
I was just about to mention that, yeah. So John Cage interned for Oscar Fischinger and wrote him this acrostic poem. Have you seen this poem? I'm gonna send it to you when we get home. But it's basically like, thank you, thank you, thank you. It doesn't say thank you at all, actually, but it says something about like, you set me on fire and I couldn't run into the water and I became a musician when you said that forms could be set into motion through vibration, because Fischinger had this concept of spirits and objects and emancipating the spirit from each object. And John Cage was very excited by that. And in some ways, I think, it really demands a serious thinking about the whole history of 20th century experimental music, is thinking about this relationship between sound and image, especially because a lot of people like Fischinger, Lillian Schwartz, they're accused of Mickey Mousing sometimes and having too much synchronization between the sound and image, going back to something like Disney's Silly Symphonies, where like, because all of these things are together, it's like too synchy. And now that we're all the way past rave culture and iTunes Music Visualizers are every day, it's really easy for the sound to overpower images like this. And I think you'll find that you could put on any of these movies and put on bunches of different songs from the radio, and you would perceive a relationship between the two that doesn't actually really exist. So this idea of having an indexical relationship between the image and the sound is really important and makes this type of work sort of unique in its own way. So I have another few films like this. One of them was made more in the Oscar Fischinger ornament sound vein. And then for those of you in the audience, actually one project that I've been working on recently at school where I teach is a second version of a computer application that we created called Spirits and Objects, that you can feed images and it will tell you how it would sound, and allow you to do basic sequences that you could then export to QuickTime and shoot onto Super 16 if you want to go through that cumbersome process. Because it actually gets super mathematic, and you just really need to, if you want to make pitches, you want to make music, you could just use horizontal lines, and you just need to take the pitch or the frequency of any pitch that you want to create and divide it by 24 frames per second, and that's how many lines you need to make that sound. So there's a lot of room to experiment with there. I was trying to pay attention during the Lis Rhodes to see what was going on there. I think that film was actually synced in post, because on the actual film strip, the sound and image are always going to be 26 frames out of sync from each other because of the distance of the two lights. But when we looked at that film strip image of Rhodes, you saw that they were actually 1 frame off. And
I like that you can tell that.
yeah, nerd alert. Yeah. So, yeah, and in blanket statement number 2, which has kind of more of a metric, rhythmic sense to it, it's actually faked. And I used a 13-frame meter so that my rhythm could be half of 26. So things are synced, but they're actually 1 image off. You don't need to know that.
Well, there's a lot of people here, and I really appreciate everyone staying. And I'd like to open it up to other people's comments or questions. As I said, it's a rare treat to have Jody here. She doesn't live here, although you're going to be here next
That's true.
semester.
January through March.
Yeah.
Let's do it again.
But do people have questions or comments? Vantia.
Just because when it comes to pattern, I think like as humans, our brains, like we try to find pattern, like sense in every pattern that we see, our patterns and everything to make sense of what we see. So when you're playing with sound and image together, what is your personal interest in like playing with that and sort of thwarting that and sort of like disrupting our need to find a correlation between sound and image for our own comfort? Like how much do you lean into that and then like take it away?
That's a great question. And let's see. 2 of the films that we saw today, the first Blanket Statement and Persian Pickles, they were actually accidents. So I just happened to have my Super 16 camera up on my animation stand instead of my regular 16 camera, and I just shot the films, not expecting them to be sound films. I actually thought they'd be silent. But then when I listened to them, I was like, whoa. There's demons living in those paisley. Did you hear that? What is going on in there? That is nuts. And that was totally a moment of surprise for me, because I expected it to be this really controlled moment where everybody would sit and watch these very austere moments in complete silence, as opposed to the Blanket Statement number 2 film, the one with rhythm, because I was purposefully trying to work with musical metrics to make almost a percussion piece in some way, but also kind of test the limits of the technology. And you see in that zoom, that's when you really get to know, like, oh, when things are bigger, when you're zoomed up, things are lower. But when you zoom out, things get higher, and you understand this pitch relationship. So that was definitely kind of a moment of discovery for me. And I think that this human impulse of finding order within chaos is a really good way to sum up a lot of the ideas that emanate from this program, especially in Petra's pieces, I think, because the computer, you know, if you keep going with the optical sound stuff, you can just get as precise as you want. And I got really into making music in After Effects, actually, with zooms and stripes. I'm like, I can be so precise in physics. Physics is so great. But is it? Am I bored with physics? Was physics not designed to understand like, how we move and things move through space? What's undiscovered out there? It becomes the more exciting question to me. So when Petra uses Maya, which again is something that's like, okay, we built the technologies and now we can completely replicate naturalistic human movement. For what? You know what I mean? So to see Petra bring all this other energy and soul out of those hands, these digitally constructed hands, it really it allows for this sense of play and discovery a little more than just findings, if that makes sense. Thank you so much for your question.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question. I was hoping that you could expand a little bit on the absence of emotion. When you spoke about Tony Conrad's Flicker or Paul Sherritt's works in particular, because they're working with this kind of imagery, but also with a particular sonic value, and then also with a kind of velocity, or let's just say a motion with sound and vision. When you were saying kind of the fact that they were maybe more sterile, I'm just curious as to maybe where you were going with that, because I think that I wouldn't necessarily define it in those terms, but and I find that there's so much of a relation to the kind of motion with your work, with this kind of the repetition and the patterning, but also the speed involved. And it's not necessarily directly linked to just 16 millimeter, but also to the fact of how we're moving with it, moving in and out, and the idea of building patterns and breaking it down. Could you talk a little bit more about perhaps how you could separate your work from perhaps this kind of, or maybe you can just further talk about how maybe they're more, I don't know, you were saying that they were, what were you, they were kind of sterile. I just feel like you need to kind of explain that a little bit more, because I'm not necessarily sure that I understand that that's necessarily the case.
Sure, yeah, thanks so much for your question. And just to clarify, just because I feel that they're sterile doesn't mean that I think you guys need to think they're sterile. It's just something that I approach in my world. And what I mean by sterile or too clean or minimal is that the films oftentimes don't refer to anything in the world other than light value. And I was really interested in incorporating the materials into my films, almost adopting a sort of material as the message mantra, as a way to deal with how materials conjure up different memories for people, and how different materials signify different notions in a way that different light fields just can't possibly. So that was really where what I was getting at with that comment. And as far as like I don't know that I necessarily feel separate from those guys. I definitely feel like I started making work 30 years after they did, and like I'm continuing or kind of mixing or hybridizing a series of traditions that started then. But I wouldn't think that we're really different in many ways. We're shown together a lot still, and of course I think a lot of the films do propel these questions of vision and stroboscopia that are very central to a lot of my interests in animation.
So I'm just curious then, so how you feel that light maybe falls short upon materiality then of, let's just say, texture or textiles. That the idea of introducing light in a way that doesn't necessarily build itself to some sort of value structure is maybe what you're introducing in your own work, which is textile or something else other, when itself still is ultimately color and light.
Is that a question?
Yeah, it is. Well, yeah, it is, because I'm just curious that I think that the idea of speaking about light as a form of in a form that could be a little reductive, I feel that it kind of strips away in terms of the pure force that we're talking about, which is within film. When we're talking about 16 millimeter film, we're talking about light. And it's so much intrinsic as part of your work itself. I think that the idea of Tony Conrad's Flicker, for example, was not necessarily sterile, but was speaking about, of course, the more minimal forms of what it was to be film and light, of course, projected. But I don't necessarily think it's stripped of a way in which we could interact personally right? And
Okay,
I
yeah,
wondered
I
about
think I
that.
see where, may I respond? So I think I see where the confusion lies here. And so I want to qualify my use of the word sterile and first make it clear that there's no like value hierarchy here. I understand very well that I'm a film artist that works in light. And there's a famous anecdote about the film teacher that said, your assignment is to make a film about light. And the student said, I think the harder film is to make a film that's not about light. So we can be clear on that. But I think that my own criticism or want to move beyond works of something like the flicker film and its sterility, the word that came off the top of my head as I spoke about it, is that in general I felt that the lack of, or I sense as a teacher, that the use of light in those films or the lack of having things referred to from the actual world closes out a lot of viewers. It sounds like you get a lot from those films, which is really, really amazing. But as I teach them, I find that oftentimes those types of films speak over people. And I want to speak to people and use things that are from the dollar store and things like that. So I use the word sterile really just, accidentally or something like that, wanting to just qualify something a little bit about my own narrative, but make no value judgments towards Paul Scherritz or Tony Conrad and understand wholeheartedly their impact on the field.
I think we're very close. Amanda's giving me, do we have time for one more? Short. Is there a brief of something? Okay, yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, yes. Earlier you mentioned about a feature film that you worked on, and I'm just curious about information about that.
Yeah, it actually screened in LA here about a year ago at AFI Fest. Maybe it'll screen again. It's called The Grand Bizarre. You could email me. You could look me up on Google and find my email, and I will email you a copy if you want. But it's not published online. But it's basically a travelogue looking at the correlations between pattern in textiles, music, and language as a result of the global economy. And it is a musical made with electronic music.
That sounds incredible. Do you approach it, is it also, are there words in it or narration, or is it along the lines of what we're seeing, but this kind of has more kinds of images in it?
Great question. It's kind of both. It mostly does not have words, though a lot of the songs are made up with chopped up parts of speech. It has some imagery like this. It has stuff in real world. It takes on a picture pages, Sesame Street, travelogue vibe at times. And all the stuff that you're talking about the raves and the laser light shows, it's all there. It's thinking about it, but,
Well, I was just saying, because that's such a hard, a year ago I read No Logo, and then I was thinking about how heavy this subject is, right? Of Naomi Klein's No Logo. Yeah, so thinking about international textiles and where it's gone, it's I couldn't even go to a party and talk to anyone because I was just thinking about it. So it's actually a really difficult and depressing subject that there doesn't seem to be an answer to.
no answer, and it's a really difficult, hard subject that looks really pretty and makes you want to buy it at the same time. So it's just so dark, and it really, the textile pattern thing really takes us to the crux of abstraction with the problems. Because everyone's always been abstraction's not political, it's decorative, it's squares. It's no, all humans make squares, yet some people get the credit for the squares and some people don't. Then they steal them and blah. It's just it's so much. So I'm glad we agree on that.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. And
And
thank you.
thank
to
you.
Jody.
Thank you so much.